Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for our 15th week.
Gosh, is it 15? I can't believe it's 15. Wow.
Yes, it's 15, Alastair. It doesn't seem that long. This week we are interviewing Alastair on his recent article that he's written on military medals, which was a request from a broker. So if you've got any clients that have got any medals, then please do forward it. It's a wonderful read, and we're going to follow up this with talking to Alastair and asking him a few questions. So first of all, Alastair, I'm going to ask, when did you get into medals?
I think for me personally, militaria has always been a really big kind of interest. I obviously had relatives that served in various conflicts, and I think as a historian, I think history by its very nature is kind of peppered with lots and lots of different military conflicts, and from that you get military medals, you get military items, you know, such as swords, guns, things like that, which are all rather interesting, or at least I find them rather interesting.
Well, certainly with all the VE Day celebrations that we had during May, it really brings it home. So let me start with asking you, what is a medal?
Okay, so it's a good question, because I don't think a lot of people will see them at kind of, you know, commemorations and obviously Remembrance Sunday and things like that, but not actually realise the actual reason that we have them. So a reward, a decoration, a medal is a government, or in previous times a crown, award really for military action or heroism during conflict. There are other medals for civil kind of rewards and things like that, such as firemen, policemen, but I think today we're going to primarily focus on the military side of things. These things now, I suppose, have been awarded for centuries, I suppose, with the first example being kind of in ancient Egypt, really, and after that, Roman times. I mean, I don't know if you probably know this, right? You know, the talk bangles that you get, kind of the round kind of copper things. Well, actually, believe it or not, originally in Roman times, they would have been made from solid gold, and actually a military award, so to speak, as to, you know, how well people have actually, you know, performed in certain conflicts. Now, it's not just, you know, a disc of metal on a ribbon that one would consider to be a medal. I think in some tribal communities, they still have medals that are actually tattoos. So they would actually have a tattoo of a symbolism of a campaign or something along those lines. So they fall into many categories. The main kind of similarity between a lot of them, obviously, is that they were awarded for military combat or conduct, shall we say.
I think there's nothing nicer than seeing what I would call all the old gentlemen with all their medals on there, which they proudly present. But obviously, medals are given not only for gallantry, they're also given for service. So what's the difference between the two?
Okay, so the ones that everyone knows, and we'll come on to those in a little bit more kind of detail, but service medals effectively are awarded for a certain amount of time that was spent during a campaign. So, for example, you've got, you know, the First World War medals that are, you know, quite popular as service medal. In fact, I'll just see if I've actually got an image of one of those. Bear with me 2 seconds, Rachel. I'm sure I have somewhere. Let's have a quick look. So we have here what are, you know, the pretty much kind of not standard but very well known campaign medals. So you've got the 14-15 star there, and then we've got the British War Medal and the Victory Medal. So those are the ones that you would have primarily seen, I suppose, coming from the First World War. And there were things that were kind of added onto that with gallantry, but the vast majority of people who served in that First World War, they would have had one of those, 2 of those, or all 3 of those. So that's a really good example of what I would describe to be a campaign medal.
What dictates the colour of the ribbon?
I think it's not pot luck, but I think they do actually come through kind of with some kind of process of deciding what they are. I think in some aspects it's the same as kind of the conditions of the land and things like that. There is a process to it. What it is exactly for those ones, I'm afraid I couldn't tell you, but there is a process for it.
So what makes a medal valuable? I mean, we see all these medals, but what actually makes it valuable?
I suppose the thing with medals for me, and the reason why medals are so absolutely fascinating for me, is because it's not actually the medal that's valuable. It's you're basically you're valuing the person that it was awarded to. And if you look at a medal, it's not necessarily just an object. It's a history. It's that person's life, and it is what they did and the way they performed in action and what you're looking for. I mean, if you look at things, I don't know, a few years ago, things were very, very different. Up to about, in the 1970s and the 1980s, World War I medals like the ones we just saw were virtually worth nothing. They were really considered to be not particularly valuable medals. People were collecting Victorian medals because they were what everyone assumed to be the things that you should collect. But these things were going, I think they almost virtually had a set price of about £5 each, and people just didn't want them in the same way that they do now. But if you look at them now, what people are collecting is certain names, certain regiments, certain battles. And it even gets to the point where if you're a local historian, you're wanting to collect a certain regiment. So, for example, where I am, where I live now, it would be interesting for me to collect a Lincolnshire regiment, a disbanded regiment, and some people specifically collect disbanded regiments. And it's all down to things like that. It's all down to connections. And do you know what? The one thing that has really, really spiked the value of medals in the past 10, 15 years? Have a guess.
I have no idea.
Ancestry websites. People,
Oh, really?
Yeah, because what people can do is they can look back through generations and generations and generations of basically people, and the Commonwealth Graves one as well. You can find out your long lost relatives, where they served, who they served for, and you can try and buy their medals. And I'm not being funny, but I mean, I thankfully know where most of the medals are awarded to my family. But if you actually, let's say you recently discovered that 3 generations back, your long lost great uncle twice removed fought on the first day of the Battle of the Somme and was killed in action, and you found his medal up for sale, you wouldn't think twice about spending a significant amount of money on it, would you? It really is a personal connection with these items, but also along with the personal connection, there is value that kind of is attached to the more interesting medals. And when I say interesting medals, I mean things such as gallantry and other bits and bobs like that. So the medal groupings really are I mean, phenomenal. What I'm going to do is, one of the most valuable medals that I think we all know about is the Victoria Cross. And the Victoria Cross is obviously, let me just see if I can find a little image of that for you, Rachel.
I was going to say, while you do that, Alastair, there's a lovely story that the house that I live in, we ended up going to Thiepval a couple of years ago to actually find the chap who left here. I think there was 5 people that lived in this house, and he was 17 when he left to go to war, and unfortunately obviously died quite early into it. But we went to find his name that was actually, carved into the stone there, which was lovely, and no relative at all.
No, but it's that connection.
Stories.
But if you could find his medals, you would buy them and you would put them on your wall in that house, wouldn't you?
Well, maybe not going that far, but
perhaps it's just me.
But the story, it's the stories that you hear and the photographs that you see. I mean, it's all so lovely, and it just really, it's part of our heritage and our history.
Oh, definitely. I'm in total agreement with that, and I think we've seen some fantastic collections of medals over the years, and I think actually more so in recent years, whether it be with the commemoration a few years ago of the First World War, or this year, or I think there is still a good percentage of the country that really wants to celebrate these these heroes and actually look at the medals as something to really be proud of. But let's just have a look at.
They certainly shouldn't be forgotten.
Oh gosh, no. And I don't think that'll happen, but let's just have a look. And obviously this is one of the more recent Victoria Crosses that were awarded. And what do you know about the Victoria Cross, Rachel, I know anything specifically? I'll take from that. So, okay, so the Victoria Cross obviously came across during the time of Queen Victoria. And I think the thing that she was looking for more than anything else was a gallantry medal that wasn't just for officers, it was literally for everyone. So 1856, it actually came about, and it was kind of brought in for the Crimean War. And it actually says on it, for valor, and I think Queen Victoria actually changed the wording on it because she wasn't quite actually happy with it. And I think the description for it actually is basically for most conspicuous bravery. I think so in the field of conflict, really something that takes the biscuit, really, to be perfectly honest.
Do they actually have their name on them, Alastair?
These ones will do. Now, again, we'll come to the problem with names on medals is, again, it's really, really easy with First World War medals and earlier medals because they will have the name, their number, their regiment, and their rank on them. But Second World War medals, unless they've been marked afterwards, haven't. So it's very difficult to say this medal was awarded to somebody during the Second World War. And the only way you can accurately do that is by you get a little sheet with a little box from the Second World War, and it tells you which ones they're entitled to. And we still don't know if they've been messed about with. There were certain ones that were restrikes, but we'll come on to that later. But a very, very sad story, I suppose, is ones from the Victorian time that were marked were traditionally made of silver. And what happened was, when they were made of silver, the person who was awarded them, unfortunately, would die, and then the family would be left in kind of turmoil financially, and they would scrub the names off them, and then they'd go to the pawn shop. So you can that's if you wanted to get into medal collecting, that's one way of getting into it quite cheaply, because these things do come up, and without a name on them, they're substantially cheaper. But anyway, back to the VC now. Originally the medal was due to be made from copper, and when Victoria saw it, she didn't really like the appearance of it, and she thought it was too shiny. So they actually got a pair of cannons that were captured during the Crimean War. So the story is that all of these Victoria Crosses were actually made from these two cannons. Now, they've actually looked at this in slightly more detail, and actually the guns were probably from China. And they were actually initially taken by Russia during conflict, and then used by Russia during the Crimean War, and then taken by British forces during the Crimean War, and then used for the Victoria Cross medals. Now, there was also a rumour, because obviously during the First World War, there were quite a lot of these issued, about just over 600 or so. Predominantly Army, quite a few Navy, and quite a few Air Force. But the rumour was actually that they didn't have enough metal, and so they actually had to use some more guns that they captured from the Boxer Rebellion during the previous century that they happened to have stored somewhere. Now, lots of people have poo-pooed this rumour, so whether that's actually true or not, I don't know, but I quite like the story. But supposedly now, there's about 10 kilos left of the two guns that were seized. I think it was at Sevastopol or somewhere around there, possibly Sevastopol or Inkerman, where these guns came from. And there's about 10 kilos of the actual metal that's left, and they're stored in a vault. And it's Hancock's, the jewelers, made the first one, and they've made every single one since. So exactly the same jewelers have actually have been through them, each and every single one of them, so that the box there and each and every medal that you see in museums. I think the vast majority of them nowadays are in museums, and there are lots of them that are owned. Well, I say owned on permanent loan to museums. I think that's where the vast majority are.
So when a medal goes to the individual for their gallantry and their bravery, and what actually, or their service, what actually goes to the regiment? Does anything go to the regiment?
I think they receive some kind of notification, and I think they receive some paperwork, but ultimately it's not necessarily a regimental citation, and a regimental citation would be an award to the regiment as such, and you get a little colour to go on the tunic. It really is. Gallantry medals really are a very, very personal thing, and I think when you look at some of these, it's it's fantastic individual effort, whilst obviously being supported by the regiment and probably far more than that. It is something that is a very, very personal thing.
So today, when we value medals, and often we will go to regiments to value those medals, is it medals that are currently owned by serving officers?
There can be, but a lot of I had a situation a long time ago. I live relatively near a lot of RAF bases because I have a house in Lincolnshire. But there are lots and lots of ones that have been either donated or are on permanent loan, for example, and they still have to insure those obviously as their property. But a lot of them, I think there is still a lot of regimental camaraderie. I think that's the best thing for it. And I think whilst there are a lot of medal collectors out there that would like to own certain medals, I think keeping them within the regiment is an important thing for a lot of people. And I understand that, but serving officers generally will have their own medals, and they will keep those medals until they decide that they don't want to have them. Sometimes, I mean, for example, having a Victoria Cross, even, the chaps from Afghan or from Iraq, I mean, the base figure for one of those, even, just if you were looking at selling it tomorrow, even though it's a recent conflict, is probably 400, 500,000 pounds. Because it's that scarce, but people are willing to buy them, and people want to buy them because military history is, you look at any form of military at the moment, and it's such a huge market.
So when you're actually going to do evaluation, what is it that you're looking for? What are you considering at that point?
It's a strange one with medals, because when we look at most other things, condition is one of the first things you look at. And ultimately with medals, it's not really that important. And I know it sounds strange, but what you want to look at is you want to look at records. You want to look at who they are. You want to look at military records. And this is where really looking at the medals is one part of it, but looking at everything else that goes with it is actually the main part, because you're doing the research on the person. And as I said at the start of this, you're not really valuing the medals, you're valuing the person, because it's that person that was awarded these. And in terms of the majority of medals, apart from the Second World War ones, you've got their name on them, and I think that's the most important part, to be honest. I'm going to show you a couple of examples, Rachel, of what I deem to be some astonishing medal groups that actually are fascinating in more ways than just medals. So let's just have a look at these. Where are we? Okay, so if we look at these were actually sold back in 2017, I believe, and they were ordered to Vice Admiral Gordon Campbell. Now, Gordon Campbell was a Royal Navy officer, and if you look, he's obviously got the Victoria Cross, but he's got a Distinguished Service Order, and can you see there are actually 3 bars on that? So that basically means that's a triple DSO. So you've got to be pretty blooming good to kind of get to that kind of state. So not only a triple DSO, but also a Victoria Cross. He's got a Croix de Guerre in the back there, which is the French award as well. And to be perfectly honest, as I say, you've got to be fairly good to be kind of looking at these. Now, as I say, these sold back in 2017, and they sold for £700,000. And that's hammer price. So with commission, probably 850. Now, the way in which military medals have sold, this came with a fantastic backstory. If we had more time, I'd go into the whole story. But he wrote books on his naval command, and it's strange because, like I say, you could write a book about it, but a lot of people have done, and it's a phenomenal thing. But if you're looking at insuring that group today, you'd be close on to £2 million looking at an insurance value, because it really is one of the pinnacles in terms of medal groups. And again, First World War group, so it's up there with the best of them, to be honest, Rachel.
So we had the recent press story where there was a chap that was faking medals in his, I think, was it in his shed in the back garden? So, I mean, are they general ones? How can you tell fakes? What do you look for?
The ones I saw were all DFCs, Distinguished Flying Cross. and the way in which he was making. I think the problem is, and this is something that not a lot of people appreciate, is that restriking has been going on for years and years and years. So, for example, if you lost your medals or anything else like that, you could apply to the government and actually have new one sent out to you. And for the Second World War, they weren't any different. So you don't know whether those ones were the original ones or whether they were restrikes that were sent out to them in the 1960s. And the most confusing thing, British medals are slightly different. With Second World War German medals, for example, all the machinery went to Poland straight after the war. And then basically, because at the end of the Second World War, the quality of the medals that were actually being manufactured by the Germans was absolutely appalling. They were basically using any metal that they could get their hands on. So they were terrible. So you see these iron crosses that you could literally bend with two fingers, that they're awful. So when they were being basically forged or faked in Poland in the 1960s and the 1970s, they didn't really have to work that hard because they were fairly rubbish in construction anyway. But the problem is it was exactly the same dyes, exactly the same casting techniques, so they are indistinguishable. So there is a lot of Second World War iron crosses that are going back around as being genuine that aren't. But military medals from Britain were always made to a slightly higher standard, but it kind of works to the similar thing whereby if something's popular, they're going to fake it. And whether it's a sovereign, whether it's a Nathaniel Mills silver cigarette case, or whether it's a DFC, it's always going to be kind of that problem. And because the DFC, there was a few more of them. DSOs are slightly more difficult to forge because there's enamel work. But gallantry medals that were single metals, such as the DFC or the Military Cross, were a lot more easy to actually forge. And that's what I think they've been working on. But again, they're difficult to tell. But again, this is why it's so important to have context. It's so important to have other things that go with it, because generally speaking, if your relative had a Military Cross or a DFC, it would not be unreasonable to expect the family to have kept some kind of gumph that goes with it, whether it be newspaper articles, whether it be military records, whether it be diaries. And all of that will add to the value of the medal group, but it'll also make everyone's life easier in terms of authenticating it, because it really is, it's all, as I say, I'll say it again, it's all about the person. It's not about the medal.
The story that's attached to it.
It's all about the story. And that's why, as a historian, I love it, because you're looking at, you can literally go from the day they first walked into a recruitment office, and unfortunately you can go to the last day and you can find out where their grave is in Normandy. It's really, you can trace all of these things and you can put together a story, and you are selling that person's military career or valuing that person's military career.
So is it easy to date medals when obviously a medal is being given for an act and it's during a certain conflict and it's obviously given to an individual? So how do you actually, look at a group of medals and actually work out what date they're from?
Generally speaking, certain medals were awarded for certain conflicts. If you're looking at military crosses, for example, they will have the cipher of the monarch that's actually on the throne at the time. So you can narrow it down by that. Generally speaking, I can look at military records, and if somebody's been awarded a certain gallantry medal, I can find records of it with my sources relatively easy. And from that, it's a jigsaw puzzle, really. You work out, you can see, okay, they were in such and such a regiment, and they served in such and such a battle. And if you go back to Victorian medals, for example, you look at First and Second Boer War medals, they were very, very helpful in when they manufactured those, because they put a nice little clasp on each specific conflict that they're involved in. So you've got the Transvaal, you've got Orange Free State, you've got all of these different kind of battles. So you can actually work out where they were. And this is why I think potentially, as I said, back in the 70s and the 80s, they were, those medals were far more valuable than the First World War medals. But that's kind of been flipped on its head, obviously, in the past few years or so. But generally speaking, with the aid of records and with the fact that these things do change with every monarch, they're relatively easy to date.
Well, as always, our webinars are based on a recent article, and obviously you have just done one on military medals. But before we finish, I always like to ask, if you had all the money in the world and you could buy anything, and obviously in the field of medals, what would you buy?
It's funny you should say that, Rachel, because considering I came up with this question initially on all of them, I thought you might spring it back on. So I've actually got you a photo of what I think, in terms of modern medals, I think is the pinnacle, and what talks to me, because I lived through, and you lived through a lot of these conflicts. So I'll just bring these up now, and there's a good little story to go with them. So it looks simple. What can you tell me, Rachel, about all four of them that you can see from the image?
I think they've all got the same Queen's head on.
Exactly.
So they've got Elizabeth.
Yeah, exactly. So they're all from the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. So looking at this, it's a really interesting collection, because the first medal that was actually issued here is the General Service Medal from 1962. So the chap that actually was awarded these was a career soldier, joined relatively early on in his life, and he was actually in the Marines, and actually then went on to be in the Special Boat Service and was incredibly highly regarded. So you've got his original service medal from 62, but then you've got the Queen's Gallantry Medal, which is coming on to as late as 1982, the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal, and basically he started off as low as you can possibly be and ended up as the highest NCO status that you could possibly be. So he literally went from down at the bottom to down at the top, up at the top, and this is his complete record. It's just a simple collection of late 20th century medals that basically sum up a NCO's life in the Marines. And in terms of interest, I find that just as fascinating, really. You've got the Falklands in there, you've got Northern Ireland in there. He will have seen action in various other places as well. And I just find that very, very interesting. So that would be the one, not necessarily that I would have, but the one that I would find the most interesting. And we looked at the other one being worth about 700,000, somewhere like that. That is still worth about 50, 60 grand. So for something that is late 20th century, I think that's a really nice set of medals.
Well, thank you, Alastair. Well, thank you again. It's been great talking to you. One of the things I did want to say to everybody is, if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, please do connect with us both. All our articles go out there, and it's a great way of us getting tools for you to actually use with your clients. So anyone that has a medal collection, please do forward on Alastair's article. It's an interesting read. And I'd like to thank you again.
Always a pleasure, always a pleasure.
Well, enjoy your valuation tomorrow when this is actually going out.
I shall do. I'm in another nondescript hotel this evening, but alas.
Excellent. Well, super. Thank you so much, Alastair. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you soon.
Take care, Rachel. Bye-bye now.
Bye.